unique experience that year. There was a lot of young families that had come out and were starting to join the church. And there was a lot of families and a lot of kids. And so when the time came time for the pageant, a young boy was selected to play Joseph. Now, he wasn't selected to play because he had some great knowledge of the Bible story or because he had done it before. He was brand new to this. He was chosen probably because of his height. He had to look good on the stage next to Mary. And so they had chosen the scriptures, they had chosen everything that was going to happen, and there was a narrator who, of course, would tell the story while the children more or less acted out all of the parts. And at first, the narrator was given the story in a different version, a version called King James. And the words were very distant and very foreign to the kids. They really didn't understand them. So they decided, we're going to change these up. We're going to use a more modern version to the words so they understand every word and what it means. And so the scene came where Joseph and Mary come walking across the platform, and they get to do what they're going to do. They're on their journey heading towards Bethlehem. And the narrator, she keys in exactly when she's supposed to, and she says, Joseph went to register with Mary, who was promised in marriage to him. And Joseph and Mary are walking across the stage. And then the narrator says, she was pregnant. And right there, Joseph stopped in his tracks. He turned and he looked at the girl who was acting as Mary. He then turned and he looked out in the congregation and he says, pregnant? Of course, the director was appalled that this had broken the entire scene, but the congregation loved the unexpected event in that story. Every character and every scene, if we really think about it, in the Christmas story is completely unexpected. A young married girl, a man who has no social status or power, a stable instead of a birthing room or a hospital, all completely unexpected. This morning we're going to dip into the scripture passage that talks about who receives the very first birth announcement. And we have to wonder, how about giving the most important news ever told throughout all of human history to a group of people who have no internet connection? They have no social media presence. They have the fewest followers on Facebook, the fewest likes on Twitter and Instagram. They have no governmental vote. They've never written a book or published a magazine article. They have no power or authority. They are certainly not part of the elite status. There's no endorsement contracts to what they're doing. They don't have any product lines with their names on them. There are no top 10 hits that came out of them. They've never done an appearance on 60 Minutes, the Today Show, Oprah, or Ellen. And yet, God chose them. God chose the most unexpected group to receive the very first birth announcement. The most important news that's ever been told throughout all of history. News that 2,000 years later, millions of people around the world are preparing for and celebrating and giving honor and praise. A group of people who Scripture tells us were out in the field. Shepherds. Shepherds out in the field. Now for us today, we don't really have a whole lot of shepherds wandering around Somers Point. So it may be a little foreign for us to understand what a shepherd was. And I myself was actually surprised to learn that shepherds were actually a very prominent position to hold. It was a very elite kind of thing. It was an honor to be asked to be the shepherd for a chief and his flock. But of course that was all before Egypt. That was all before captivity. That's back when sheep were honored and praised because of their vitalness to our entire economy. But once the nation was led into Egypt, and once they were held under captivity, and once they moved into what we would now call urban living, once they moved into the city, then the whole idea of hanging out with animals and shoveling dung, it lost all of its favor. Soon, a nation became comfortable with being part of an urban kind of environment where we receive everything we need. We go to work and then we buy everything and we barter and we trade for it. No longer were we working on the land just for ourselves. Being part of the urban was more desirable than to be out in the rural part, out in the farms where there was danger and mayhem constantly happening. And so the idea of the shepherd just went farther and farther and farther down the food chain. And they were never really completely dismissed until the religious authorities started stepping in. See, the religious authorities started to create rules as to who could come to the temple and who could practice all the temple rituals. And they created this idea of being unclean. And so shepherds became unclean and unwanted. But it certainly wasn't because of what they were doing. It was because of what they were doing. They were walking around in sheep stuff. They were dealing with unclean, filthy animals all day. And simply because they were doing that, they were now labeled unclean. And they were no longer wanted in the temple. Because they weren't necessarily less than, but they certainly were unclean. I feel bad for the shepherds. I mean, how can you be a shepherd without every once in a while stepping in it? Kind of feel like us some days. No matter how good we try to do, there are days when we simply step in it. And yet their livelihood was extremely vital to the local economy. The wool provided clothing, obviously, and their meat was eaten, and their livestock was used as part of the ritual practices inside the temple. And yet, like so many today who perform for us very vital services for us, they were looked down upon. We have people in our own society today who we look down upon. There are people that we look up to because of their careers, and there are people who we look down to because of their dirtiness of their jobs. So why would God choose a group like that to give the most important good news of all of history? Why would he do that? Because we know from all of our studies that God gave the good news to everyone and for everyone. And didn't God want that news to spread as quickly and as fast as possible? Why did God choose the shepherd? Well, let's look at the very first verse that we read today in Luke, chapter 2, verse 8. It said, in that region, there were shepherds living in the fields, keeping watch over their flock by night. Luke is setting up this group. He doesn't tell you that they're just shepherds. He tells you where they were and what they were doing. He tells you they were doing a very important job for the community. They were dedicated to their work. And their work speaks volumes about who they were. Even the Apostle Paul, he refers back to them when he wrote in 1 Corinthians in chapter 1. He says this, but God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, things that we call not, to reduce to nothing the things that we call are. Even Paul recognized that God is the most unexpected thing in the world. Everything he does is completely unexpected. It turns everything upside down and topsy-turvy. And so God chose this group of shepherds. And Luke is very clear about what they were doing when they were chosen. Now think about the daily life of a shepherd. In the morning, they would get up and they would go and they would call their sheep out of the flock, out of the fold, out of the pen. Some to you that they may bring a familiar message that we've heard before about the sheep know their shepherd by his voice. And so the shepherd would go and make a guttural sound and be very specific to him and his sheep, and they would come out and we'd lead them out into the pasture for them to be fed and watered. Now, you've probably heard sheep aren't real self-sufficient. They're not real intelligent about keeping themselves safe and fed. And so that job is up to the shepherd. The shepherd has to take them out into the pasture where there's food and available to them. And if there's no water, he has to lead them to the river or to the stream. He has to lead them to the still waters where they can drink. Lead me beside still waters. And in the evening, after they had been fed and exercised and they had something to drink, he calls them back into the pen, into the fold. And as they're going through the gate of that, he counts them and ushers them through, and he makes sure that they're all there and accounted for. And if one is missing, he has to go and find the one and make sure that the one is brought back. And then it's the shepherd's job to stay there by the gate, to guard the gate, to make sure that nothing gets into attack and none of them get out to get lost. It's a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week job. But it's a job that requires a heart of tenderness and caring and dedication. And then the next morning the shepherd will awake and they will start that day all over again. Just from the simple duties of a shepherd throughout the day, you understand that a good shepherd requires a lot of watchfulness, a lot of tenderness. Especially towards those sheep that were young and feeble, or perhaps if there were any sick or helpless ones in the fold, or those who were broken or lost. The job of a shepherd requires a lot of humility. You have to be very humble to be able to do that job, day in and day out. That's probably why in Matthew's Gospel he quotes Jesus in Matthew chapter 20. So the last will be first, and the first will be last. Shepherds were chosen by God because of their extreme humility, their dedication, their love, their watchfulness, their tenderness. That all comes from understanding how humble we have to be when we've accepted God into our hearts. You know, Billy Graham was a great orator about people following Jesus and accepting Jesus. And he said when people accept Jesus into their own hearts, then there's proof of that. There's a result that happens. There's a change that happens in our lives. And that change is humility. It makes us humble in the world. In announcing Jesus' birth to this group, this most unexpected group, God's demonstrated His love for everyone. That the message goes to all, not just to whom we think should receive it. Billy Graham often used this scripture in 1 John chapter 3. See what love the Father has given us, that we should be called children of God. And that's what we are. And Billy Graham says that's what transforms our hearts and makes us humble. God unexpectedly chose the shepherd to teach us humility. But there's also anything, if you ask someone who's ever walked with Jesus, who's ever invited Jesus into their hearts, you know that as we walk with Him, there's this unexpectation that some people have when it first happens. That all of a sudden my life is going to be great now. Now that I've accepted Jesus, all of my troubles and all of my trials are going to go away. All of my fears and my addictions are going to disappear because life is going to be grand now that I'm following Jesus. Some of you and I know that walking with Christ is anything but that. Accepting Christ into our hearts is not about changing the external parts of our lives. It's not about releasing ourselves from the good and the bad. It's about understanding who it is that's going to walk with us through the good and the bad. In the Gospel of Mark, in chapter 8, it's a great account of the life of Jesus. And he talks about what this relationship is going to do. He says, and calling the crowd to him, Jesus, with his disciples, he says to them, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself. Take up his cross and follow me. You know, today we've got a lot of this idea about being followers, right? A lot of things on social media about who's following who and who's tweeting with who, and how many followers do you have, and how many followers do all the celebrities have. It's not unlike the days in the 60s and 70s when the idea of groupies came out. There were people who followed bands and celebrities, and we became groupies of people. And we follow these people, and it takes up some of our time, doesn't it? Like, being a groupie back in the 60s and 70s meant waiting long lines to get tickets to go to see their shows and spending hard-earned money to try and get in. Today, we spend countless hours surfing the web trying to follow them and see every word they say and everywhere they've been and where they eat lunch. Because we're following them. It takes time. But we also know there may be a reward. You know, if you're like me and you're a follower of Starbucks, and you follow them long enough, every once in a while they throw you a free coffee. And a little ding comes up and you think, oh, I won. And there's this great reward for being a follower. And yet the price may not be worth the reward. In many instances, this idea of free stuff and recognition is why we're a follower. But following Jesus is not like that at all. Following Jesus can be very costly. It even appears like there's consequences. In Luke's Gospel, later in chapter 14, he says, whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. Jesus was not talking about being a Twitter follower or an Instagram watcher or anything like that. He was talking about changing our entire lifestyle. He was talking about being something brand new. He was talking about being more and more like Jesus Christ. You know, that's what John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist Church, that's what he was talking about. When John Wesley talked about going on to perfection, when he talked about leading a life of sanctification, it was transforming our lifestyle so that we lived a life that was now as identical to Jesus Christ as we could possibly ever be. And when you and I seek a relationship with Christ, we desire to become more and more like Christ. We want to be the example that Jesus was for us, and we want to be that example for others. Because that's how God designed us. And when we do that, we take risks. We take a lot of risks. The shepherds were all about risk in their lives. In their daily duties, they were out there in the field. Remember, the specific story says that they were out in the fields, away from the protection of the city and the walls. They were out there where there was lions and panthers and bears and animals trying to come after their sheep. There were robbers and other humans trying to get what they wanted as well. They were living under nature in the hot and the cold. The Gospel of Luke, chapter 2. When they saw this, they made known what had been told them about this child. And all who heard it were amazed at what the shepherds told them. Now I know we all know that the shepherds heard the great story from the crowd of angels who came and sang. We all know that the shepherds obeyed because they got up and left the fields. They came into town and they went to the stable. And we all know that they knelt at the manger of Jesus where they worshiped. We've seen it in the nativities. We know that part of the story. But did you know that they then went? They got up and they left the nativity scene. And they went and they told shepherds. Who's going to listen to them? In the Gospel of Luke, he says very, very clearly, he doesn't say they were amazed at the shepherds telling them. They were amazed that the shepherds were even speaking. They were amazed that anyone was listening to a shepherd. No, Luke's Gospel is very clear. It says that all who heard it were amazed at what the shepherds told them. They were amazed at the good news. They were overcome by the good news. They were moved by the good news because the shepherds took the risk. God calls this group of the most unexpected because they were so humble. And God used them to teach us about taking risks to spread the good news. And I think all of this wraps around a much larger story about Christmas. You know, several years ago, a story was put out about a school teacher who started volunteering to visit sick children. And in her off time, and whenever she could, she would go and volunteer to go to the children's homes, to the hospital, to help them continue with their studies so they wouldn't be so far behind when their illness was over. But she tells about her very first assignment going to the hospital. And she was all excited that she had gotten this assignment, and she got the boy's name and room number, and she really didn't put two and two together, but she showed up to the hospital, and she went up to the floor, and then she realized where she was. She was in the critical care unit of the burn center. And when she stepped into that little boy's room, all she could see was his disfigured face, and all she could smell was the smell of burnt flesh. She stopped for just a moment, and then she kept right on going. She walked right up to his bed and she said, "I'm the volunteer teacher. I'm here to help you with your English. We're going to get started. Let's open a book." And she began to teach. She taught for some time, and then they closed up their books and she went on her way. Very next day, the teacher comes back to do the next lesson, and in the hallway, the duty nurse stops her and she says, "What did you do to that little boy yesterday?" And this being the teacher's first time, she immediately took back and began to apologize for whatever she did, and she didn't know she'd do it. Just tell her she wouldn't do it again, and she became very apologetic. And the nurse said, no, it's not that. We've been trying for weeks to get a response out of this young boy. And we know that if he does not have a desire to continue, everything we do for him medically is not going to work. But last night, he turned a corner. He is doing so much better. It's just amazing whatever you did. And the teacher said, "I didn't do anything. We just had a lesson in English." So the teacher and the nurse, they go into the room with the little boy, and they just exchange pleasantries. And they said, "So how did you enjoy yesterday's lesson?" And he said, "I could not have enjoyed it more. All these weeks in the hospital, I thought for sure I was going to die. But when they sent me a teacher to learn something new, I found hope. Hope that I could live. Hope that there was life beyond this death that I'm now living. God sent us His Son to teach us that we have hope. That there is hope past death. And that there is hope beyond anything that we think overcomes us. All of our trials and our tribulations. I think sometimes at Christmas we already know the story. We know what the nativity looks like. We know all the figurines that should be in it. And we get a little complacent. And we think we know what to expect. But our God is all about unexpectations. He's all about using those we don't think and speaking to those who don't feel adequate and reaching out where He needs to reach out so that His message goes to all, to everyone, and for everyone. But when we get complacent, we tend to forget about the people who are in need. We forget about those who are waiting for us to step up and take the risks, to spread the good news, to share the wonderful story. We can't miss the unexpected. We need to embrace it and know that God is working deep, deep inside of it. When the angel spoke to the shepherds, they then responded by saying, "Let us go now to Bethlehem and see this thing that has taken place, which the Lord has made known to us." You and I have been invited into the story of Christmas. How are we going to